There's so much information here. I sent you the document. There's a lot of information, so I do not have it all retained. But
no, I know.
I do have main notes, but
I read it through, and then I took some. I kind of took a few points out. Maybe we can talk about. Maybe we can talk about those. But it's mainly a chance for you to give us your own take on it.
Sure.
I mean, there's just such a massive amount, isn't there?
Well, I thought off the back of it, I would kill two birds with one stone, because I've got my own Independence Live offering in a week. So I thought, back in March for episode 2, we did the potato clearances and how it wasn't very much about potatoes. And a lot of this goes hand in hand with that information, because it's really off the back of that. That we're having this problem that huge swathes of Scotland are depopulated and aren't put to any kind of productive use. Still, to this very day.
Still, I know, and I that's great actually. And if you of course you use this for.
Why I'm going to do a kind of part 2 to the potato clearances. I'm just going to call it Scottish land issues or something, yeah.
Oh, you could call it. When the chips are down.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just switch on the recording. I don't need to think about that any longer. So I'll do a wee intro, sure. and then I'll hand over to you.
Well, I don't even know how I would start. How are we going to begin this?
I thought I'd sort of I'll sort of say, like, I'm talking to you here. It's arisen out of the programme.
I watched yesterday's show with Bernara and that, because I used quite a lot of that in some stuff that I typed up last night. Yeah. It wasn't so much Bernara, it was to the south of that. It was North Uist and Barra in particular, where some really terrible things happened in the mid-19th century. But I found an article, it'll be included in that document I sent you now, because I added it to it. It's at the very start. It was a journalist went over and was witness to people being evicted. And it's just a fantastic article, which is going to probably form the basis of my video next week. So.
Fantastic. That's fantastic. Okay, so I suppose, let me just get going. And it's the same as we said before, Jenny. I mean, we're just recording it. I mean, at any point we can stop and, go back.
Sure. You can play about and edit it and things.
I didn't quite mean that. Then just saying we'll stop. Fiona does all the editing, and she's getting really, really good at it. So okay, so today I'm sitting here, as it were, in the studio with Jenny Eales. And Jenny, thanks so much for coming in to talk to us.
You're very welcome.
And so the background to us asking you if we could have a wee chat about issues around land reform, land ownership, is that Fiona and I did a programme that went out just the other day about land reform. The programme's called Land Justice. It's an episode of the Mibbes Aye series. And we're talking about one of the things we're talking about was the community up in Great Bernera can't even get to talk to the guy that owns the island. The flamingo land, it looks like the flamingos are, trying to fly back in. There's another application to create flamingo land at the bottom end of Bala, the bottom end of Loch Lomond. So we're talking about all of that, and we're talking about the ScotGov consultation that's on. I think it maybe is just closed now, about their latest thinking on doing a bit more about land reform. But the point was we got to the end of the programme, and Shane and I thinking, well, we both know this, that, fairly familiar, meme really, isn't it? That, half of Scotland's owned by 500 people. And the thing is, I thought, I don't really understand how we've got ourselves in this pickle. I mean, I'm no great, I've never really studied, history very much. I mean, I've read a fair bit, but, so I can think, well, there was the clan system, and, that really at least was meant to be about stewardship and holding the land in common, and, not to get too romantic about it, because I'm sure there were some clan chiefs who, weren't very good at that. but that's gone, and then we had a king who was based in Edinburgh, but then he moved himself down to London in 1603, and that must presumably have had a bit of an effect on the people that owned the land. And you go through the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, and now we're here, and I don't want. Obviously, there are some landowners in Scotland now, and they do maybe think in terms of stewardship and looking after the land, and are forward looking, and in communication with the people who live on the land. But what strikes me about that is that that's still their decision. They can decide to be like that, but they can also decide not to be like that. The decision, the power of the decision making is always in their hands, no matter how forward-looking they may be. So, anyway, we thought we know someone who could probably, help us understand this a bit more. So, could you just, maybe give us a little bit of your own kind of your own kind of thoughts, because you did you've done a whole load of research for us, which is fantastic. What do you think? I mean, how is it that we've landed in this pickle?
I mean, it goes right back. I mean, the Gaelic population, especially of the Highlands, were always demonised to a certain extent. I mean, back when Malcolm Canmore married the Saxon princess St. Margaret, that invited a flood of Anglo-Saxon settlers, which took up the lowlands, mostly to the east, but the lowlands certainly pushing the indigenous population north. There was various attempts to extirpate the language, the Gaelic language. The 1616 Education Act for Scotland sought to eradicate the Irish language and convert the people to a more anglicised form of living, really, culture. It didn't work so much after the 1616. The children were learning to read the English words from the Bible, obviously, but they didn't actually grasp the meaning of the words in order to be conversant. That was solidified in the 1696 Education Act for Scotland, which made it so that the children had to be conversant in English. And at that point, they were sent maybe to the lowlands, maybe the north of England, to complete their education in the hopes that they would then bring that language and culture back to their parents and families and show them a different way of life. And so it harks back to that, really. But of course, you had the 1715 and 1745 rebellions, and vengeance seems to have become the name of the game at that point, from a Westminster point of view. They wanted to stamp out any chance of those events happening again. They wanted a proper union. They wanted us to see ourselves as one country. So the landlords, after the union, you had the 1603, like you said, James the 6th and 1st went down to London. He was followed by followers, by lords and what have you, down to the new seat of power. So they became absentee landowners, and we know what comes from a landowner that doesn't have to deal with their people. They have very little sympathy for them, almost zero empathy for their living situation or helping them really in any way. Then the 1707 Union, you had, again, the seat of power was removed. It was put down to London, and the lords that remained on the roll, they fled to London. They took their wealth and they fled to London in a bid to be part of this new centralised government. That created more absentee landowners, which was really not what we needed. Again, the 15 and the 45 rebellions made it so that they were like, do you know what? I think we can do without this. We really need to put a firm thumb on these people. We need to get a grip of these people. But you also had the fact that these lords were experiencing for themselves a new culture down in London, a culture that was more akin with ostentatiousness and living to the max and vast expenditures of money and shows of wealth. And it was really a kind of keeping up with the Joneses as far as these lords were suddenly concerned. They had to meet the levels and expectations of their new English friends who had been living this way for a while. You have to remember that England came into the Union with £20 million worth of debt already, where Scott had no public debt. The Scots were a very frugal population and tried very hard to live within their means. So suddenly they're experiencing this explosion of wealth and just a whole new society to be part of. The clearances that came off the back of that, the extirpation of the population, the depopulation of large swathes of Scotland. It wasn't just the Highlands, it was Scotland-wide and the islands. And I feel like that really rested in the fact that landowners were attempting to shirk responsibility.
Yes.
So they wanted to suddenly have full freedom of the lands. They wanted to be able to invite their new rich friends up to these beautiful grounds that they owned, these luscious forests and rivers and these estates that they held suddenly, that they were given the rights to, because the original lairds did not have outright control of the land. Their role was to divvy up the land between the population in an equal kind of sense. They were arbitrators of disputes, etc. If a dispute got more than the laird was able to contend with, it went to the king, who was the final decider of these issues. But the lairds did not have outright control of the land until after the Union and after the 45 rebellion, at which point the Westminster government decided they were going to end this feudalism, so to speak, in Scotland, this way of living that had been the case for centuries in Scotland. And they gave these lairds outright control over the land. They made them landowners and told them that they now had full control to do as they wished with their land. So the improvements began. Improvements. So, what I mean by shirking responsibility and attempting to shirk responsibility is that, I'll read you a quote from the Leaving Advertiser and Weems Gazette from 1912.
Yeah.
At one time, all the public burdens were borne by the land because landholders got the land from the state on certain conditions. These conditions were that they provided fighting material in time of war, that they kept up the church, that they looked after the poor, and contributed to education. These were obligations in return for which they got the land. The burdens had been gradually shifted to other shoulders until today, in 1912, the land only paid 4% of taxation. Now, by getting rid of the people, there were no people to go to a church that needed to be upkept. There were no people to need the education that they were to provide for them. There were no poor for them to do for. By getting rid of the people, they were getting rid of burdens that came with the land that they held and the conditions that under which they held the land.
That particular extract, it was from Leaving, wasn't it? Leaving Advertiser, 1912. That struck me as well. Actually, I think I would have, if someone had said, well, what are the obligations of a landowner, maybe a couple of 100 years, 300 years back, I probably would have said something about, well, I think they do have to provide, soldiers and if the king needs it. But I didn't know that there was an actual obligation for those other things, looking after food, benefits, church, education. That's just such a shift, isn't it? Away from, and then although that must have cost them money to do that, and then they stopped doing. They don't have to do it. A, they don't have to do it any longer, and B, they've got rid of some of the people who would have been there. So immediately their income has raised spectacularly, presumably.
So to speak, the people actually paying rent were more profitable than having animals supplant them. Sheep, cattle, grouse, land, game land, really. the forests, the deer hunting, etc., the salmon in the rivers. These were suddenly cordoned off. The people who had originally lived there were denied all right to forage, hunt, fish, and grow crops on the land where they had formerly and for generations had been able to do that. They were shifted out onto the coasts of Scotland, barren, actually unprofitable land at the time. So that's where a lot of the hardship came from during the clearances. It wasn't anything to do with potato famines. It was manufactured. These people were removed from the land that had sustained them for generations. And yeah, I mean, if they weren't shifted to the coasts, they tend to be shifted to the coasts if they rejected emigration. The landlords would pay for them to emigrate. They would also promise them that they would be provided for, that there were provisions already secured for them in Canada. It tended to be Quebec they ended up in. And, I have a quote from the Quebec Times, that lambasts these landlords because Quebec was seeing thousands of people arriving from Scotland in a destitute condition, barely alive after making it across the Atlantic. And suddenly they're in this country, they're foreigners, everyone around them strangers, they've no help, and there's no provision has been made for them. It was a lie, purely to get them on the boats. Those of them that would agree to go on the boats. If they didn't agree to go on the boats, they would flee to the cities and what have you. Huh?
Yes, that's the other thing that happened, wasn't it?
Yeah.
People moved into the central, well, in Scotland, moved more into the central belt to the cities. I mean, do you think then that, like you were saying, that actually having people on the land and paying the laird, the landowner, or lord, rent was actually provided him more income than the shift over to sheep? I mean,
yes.
If that's so, was that something? I mean, presumably, though, you can't reverse that. You can't,
no.
Even if a landowner realised that, you can't just go back because the villages and the villagers have all gone.
Well, again, it was manufactured. You were speaking of Bernera, and the North Uist removals were. You're talking about how you get emotional looking at the land. There's no more emotional subject for me than researching the clearances. Seeing what these people went through is just heartbreaking. It's just awful. So we have that they were made poor by the landowner. They were made to not be able to pay their rents by minions of the landowners, factors, etc., would literally act against the population's best interests in order to give the Lord a reason to shift the people. So if the people suddenly couldn't pay their rent and they were finding themselves in arrears, the Lord was, in this case, in North Uist, it was Lord MacDonald. He was able to then go to the authorities and say, I have a population that aren't paying their rents and I'm going to need some help evicting them. And the authorities would be like, well, yeah, we'll help you with that. No problem. If they're not paying their rent, if they're not doing what they need to sustain themselves. I'll read another quote for you just to show you how it was manufactured. After the people resisted extirpation, the officers who wanted to take their cattle, they took the cattle to the market of Lochmaddy to sell in the hopes of getting more money than they were being offered, in order to meet a promise they had made to Lord MacDonald that they would pay £4 each after that market, but they found that none of the drovers would buy any beasts from Solace, the area of North Uist that they're talking about here, as a factor had gone amongst the dealers and got them to promise that they would not deal with the Solace people. Since that period, having no money or meal, most of the people had been very ill off. Last year, the factor took the cattle for rent when they got no more than £3 for cattle that were worth 6. It was a manufactured state of affairs. They were keeping the people down in order to give them an excuse to shift them.
Oh God, it just gets from bad to worse, doesn't it? It's just so awful that anyone can do that to their own people. I mean, I can't remember now if I said anything on that programme about my experience walking over island of Ulva, which is, it was a few years, it was about 5 or 6 years, but actually it's now been taken over by a community buyout. But I was walking over it, and it's heartbreaking. It's this stunningly beautiful spot. Well, it was a lovely, sunny, blue sky day, but I mean, it's not always like that. But and ruined houses, and then you can walk by a house, and it's obvious. Then you think, oh, actually, that's the mill, because there's millstones just lying around on the land there, and it just really gets to you, doesn't it?
The way they went about evicting the people was so strong-armed. They would get the people out of the houses, then they would go and they would remove every article of belongings out the house, which didn't amount to a huge amount, maybe a few sparse pieces of furniture, some clothing, bottles, pots, etc. They would remove everything they owned out the houses, and then they would unroof the houses to make them uninhabitable.
Yeah.
And then what were the people to do?
Yeah. And on Ulva, there was a boat waiting down in the bay that was going to take them over to Canada, and the factor who was doing it he just took the cattle and everything away in payment for their passage.
Yeah.
Let's move on. Because when I was reading through the notes that you sent us, and you've found various newspaper articles about. So this is mainly maybe from about the second half of the 1800s, and we've got so there was. We found bits from the Scottish Land Reform Alliance. There's a lecture on land reform by a Liberal MP, Scottish Land Reform again. So, and what I know, so that's maybe 1880s, 1890s.
Yeah, from the 1880s,
Yeah, so what I noticed was I think in nearly all of those extracts, a lot of them are from the Scotsman.
Yeah.
Some of them are from Hansard. There's this, by that stage, there's now a link being made between we need to do something about land reform, and we're being stymied because of how Westminster Parliament works. So at this time, these two things have come together. There's the thinking about home rule. There's awareness about land reform, and they're being brought together. You've got people saying. I'll read out this one. So this is from the Scottish Reform Alliance, 1886. So this is when the Crofters Bill had gone through. So okay, that was a big step forward, but it could have been a lot better than it was. And one of the members in the Scottish Land Reform Alliance is saying he referred especially to the disappointing character of the Crofters Bill. In the House of Commons, that's the Scottish population, in the House of Commons, they had only a sham representation, and they could be outvoted at any time by English members. He saw no remedy for the state of matters except in the establishment of a parliament in Scotland. So Scotland got a parliament of our own and got all our national matters done purely by Scotch members. We would never get the business of Scotland efficiently transacted. So that's 1886, 150 years ago, a bit more than that. And we're still talking about it now.
The same words were still being repeated in the 1920s. Exactly the same words were still being repeated in the 1920s after Ireland had obtained their home rule, and Scotland failed in that regard. But the Scots MPs, they had been concerned. They wanted us lumped together with Ireland in that regard. They wanted that if home rule was to be granted to one, it was to be granted to both, because they knew that if Ireland should get it first, Scotland was going to find themselves far too underrepresented to be able to do it for themselves against the English representation in Parliament. And that fear was borne out. We only obtained our own Parliament again in 1999. So, yeah. Yeah, it's been a long fight, really, hasn't it?
It has been a long fight, and it hasn't been won yet. Well, we do have the Scottish Parliament,
we do.
And it's doing what it can. You can be critical of it, but to be fair, they're also a bit hamstrung as well.
The devolution settlement and the reopening of Parliament in 1999 was a good step forward, but it did not come near to the plethora of determination we would have had we have been able to succeed in Home Rule. Home Rule would have given us greater powers for local legislation and to do for ourselves out with Westminster. What Home Rule guaranteed was that Westminster would act as the imperial parliament only. So it would only decide on matters where the United countries of the United Kingdom were dealing with international bodies together. Yeah. They wouldn't deal with anything that was Scotland specific. So it would be like a form of evil for Scotland should we have got Home Rule. So technically with evil, what England were doing was giving themselves Home Rule, even though they don't have their own independent parliament.
Yeah. So evil being English votes for English laws. Yes, I was struck by that as well. And again, it's in one of the extracts that you sent us. That it was in a way it seemed like it was completely clear to the people of that time, sort of late 1800s, early 1900s. Yeah, what we need is 4 parliaments, Welsh, Scottish, English and Irish, to look after their own matters, and then an imperial parliament to look after...
There were Home Rulers wanted to go further than that. There were Home Rulers wanted every government that dealt with any of our colonies to also be represented in Parliament as well. They were very annoyed that they had no say within Westminster over what happened in their own countries, that they were being legislated for from thousands of miles away in some instances.
That was, I mean, if you think about that's incredibly forward thinking, isn't it? And for have someone suggesting, I didn't even realise that had ever been suggested.
Yeah, the Reverend David McRae was a big proponent of the colonies having full representation within Parliament.
So, what's your own feeling about where we are now? I mean, we have got a Scottish Parliament.
We do.
We've got at the moment there's a land reform legislation going to be going. Well, the consultations happened. There's been some suggestions in it. There are people who want it to be stronger than there and more extensive. What's your feeling about where we are now with respect to land reform for Scotland, or what we need to do next?
I mean, what we need to do next is obtain full self-determination for ourselves. That's key to achieving everything that we need to achieve. That while still attached to Westminster in any sense, we're not going to stop having these issues. We're not going to stop running up against barriers. That no matter what subject I'm doing research for, a lot of times I'm on Google Maps having a look at the area that's been talked about. And too often I'm coming across these areas that are completely depleted of industry, of residences, of anything of use. There's huge swathes of Scotland with nothing on them that could have been put to just far better use far sooner, that it's depressing. It's depressing is what it is. The fact that we're still seeing the remnants of what was happening in the 18th century in 2022 it's very sad.
Yes, indeed. Maybe just before we finish here, but maybe that we should give people a little bit of an insight into. It was 1926. So it was Scottish night in the Parliament in Westminster, which makes you think they're having a ceilidh or something.
Oh no! Can I explain that a little bit?
Okay.
So Scottish legislation in Westminster was not dealt with during the day. it often wasn't dealt with until after midnight when the press had gone home. So that Scotland wasn't actually, Scottish legislation at Westminster often wasn't reported on because the journalists weren't willing to stay up to hear it.
Well, that is just astonishing.
So when they say Scottish night, that was how legislation worked for Scots at Westminster.
They literally meant.
Literally.
They didn't just mind they were having a longer sitting in the evening, which they quite often do. Anyway, this particular one was about land reform, education and housing. And, it's 100 years ago, almost. Yeah. And it's the same, it's exactly the same things that we're still talking about. And so if I read a little bit about this, so they had one of the Scottish MPs was saying, in many parts of Scotland, the people were driven off the land. Today they had millions of acres of land lying idle, or at least converted into deer forests, and kept in that idle condition for the sport of a few millionaires. All sounds so familiar, doesn't it? Who in many instances did not belong to the country at all. People had to live under conditions that were a discredit to every government that had been in office, and while millions of acres were being reserved for a few wealthy men and women. And then this MP went on to say, it was the duty of every Scottish member to take every step to get the land restored to their own people and for their own use. And I sort of think, look, God, don't know who any of these guys were back in 1926 who were MPs from Scotland, but some of them really spoke out.
It was the Labour Party members that were at the forefront of these conversations. That the Tories felt like they were constantly being put upon by the Labour faction because it was a very Tory way of life that they were looking to subvert. It was the landowners and the sportsmen and the people of money.
And you can see that. You can see that from that. Carry on a bit in that Hansard extra, because presumably it's the Tories who come back and say, "Oh, it's just absurd to say that you can do anything more better with that land, and it's just up in the mountains. You could only kill, hunt deer and probably by that time grouse as well."
But we know there were royal commissions that said otherwise.
They were wrong, and then someone else comes in and says it was says Johnson, so he's a socialist, he's from Dundee MP. He says, well, it's just absolute rubbish to state that the land covered by deer in Scotland was fit for nothing else. It's been disproved by, and then he goes on to quote umpteen Royal Commission committees. So that sort of wrangling, it's still happening, isn't it? It's still kind of, various kind of, think tanks and groups in Scotland are still coming out and saying, look, the way we lose that land for grouse moors is so low, so badly, so few people employed there, and the amount of money that comes from it is, compared to what it could be, is pretty drastically low. So
I mean, doing what I do really has just proved to myself anyway, and anyone that follows the research that I post, that Scotland and Scots have been fighting the exact same fights for centuries now. The exact same arguments keep getting pulled out and used over and over and over again as if they're new, and they're not. We've had centuries of this. We're just going in circles.
We are. Well, hopefully we can manage to kind of break out of that circle, and or at least make it more of a spiral up than where we are at the moment. Yeah. But thanks very much for
You're very welcome
for responding to our question, and we'll hope we haven't pair of us aren't going away too depressed. But
it's always a joy speaking with you, Marlene.
Okay then, thanks again, thanks Jenny.
No problem.
I'll just switch the recording off. I mean, what you said at the end, we're still arguing what you've been arguing about it for centuries. We're still arguing about it. That's the crux of it.
I mean, it's fact. Oh. It's fact. There's far too much evidence to prove it.
Yeah. But actually, I really appreciate all the the various research that you got.
That's my pleasure. It's what I do.
Well, yeah, I know, and it's great, and we'll put it on. We'll use this. This is going to go on our Indie Live Extra site, but we'll send you. Shona will send you the video file, and you can use it however you want. And probably as well, what we'll do is write up a bit of a blog post about it, and then that means we can add in some of the actual files that they've sent us.
I've added extra to it, so I think we're at something like 26,000 words or something now. Sorry.
Well, I can't quite remember because you sent us the file. So will we get that updated file?
It should update for you. Mm-hmm. I mean, I can send you another link just to make sure of it, but it should update.
It's on Google Docs, isn't it?
Yeah,
so it should update. Yeah, that's great. Well, yeah, thanks again. We're kind of, Fiona and I are just, and Steve we're just starting to rethink a little bit how we do what we're doing, and our inclination is to carry on making those longer programs like the one about land reform, hour long, but maybe not do so many of those, but have more things that are shorter.
Yeah.
That we can get out to more easily to more places, and then refer back to the longer ones. So it's a bit of a change in tactic, really. But, anyway, we'll see how it goes.
I've embarked upon a kids channel now on YouTube. A friend of mine, a patron out in Kansas, sent me a 20-volume set of books called The Book of Knowledge from the start of the 20th century. And the information in them is incredible. I mean, it's just so eclectic. It's crazy, different information, just random information, exactly down my alleyway, just completely random information about worldwide topics, cultures, making stuff, etc.
I'll tell you, there was a set of those books of knowledge in our house.
I absolutely love them so much.
I love them. My dad, I mean, it's the kind of thing he really loved. But yeah, I know he actually got them for me. So that, not so much that I would read them myself, I was a bit young at that point, but he'd read bits out, and as I remember, there's sort of quite nice illustrations and things.
Fully illustrated.
Well.
Yeah,
fully
throughout.
Illustrated, so.
I mean, the one,
I don't...
Well, I have a set from another patron that was from the 1950s, 1960s, I think, and it's more of an encyclopedia, an A to Z format. Whereas the ones from
that's probably the one that we had.
The set that I had sent from Kansas, the one from 1950, 1960s, it's a 9-volume set, is an A to Z encyclopedia format. The ones from the start of the 20th century, it's a 20-volume set, and it's just completely random information. It's not alphabetical. It's not in any order that I've been able to find. And there's arts and crafts and all kinds of stuff that my husband is willing to do, because he's the illustrator for Random Scottish History. He's going to do the arts and crafts for the videos, and I'm really just looking to reproduce the books on a children's channel. I've called it Braw Knowledge for Bairns off a Twitter suggestion. And we're just going to put the information out that way, and they're going to be nice short little videos, So I think I'm going to end my stint on Independence Live in January. I'll do a year's worth for Independence Live, and then I'll focus on doing that. So
good.
Things.
Well, I look forward to find out more about that. It sounds great.
Yeah, I'll send you a link through. I did a wee introduction, but I'll send you a wee link through.
Yeah, do that. I'm just sort of thinking, God knows what happened to the set of books of knowledge that we had. I expect they went in the bin at some point.
Oh, I hope not. I hope they went to a bookshop or a charity shop or someone for somebody to enjoy, because they are so good. These so good. The information I can't emphasize. I love them.
Anyway, better leave it there, and I'll get this over to Fiona and
no problem.
do a magic on it.
Oh, it was wonderful talking to you, darling.